Good evening and welcome to LawTalk, the show that brings you the Constitution and the legal issues of the day one evening a month. I'm Mark Melikowski, and with me I have Kevin Kiley, and James Barrett's on vacation this month, so I'm going to be hosting. So Kevin, you've been on our show before, and last time you were here, you talked a little bit about Prop 47, but for people who missed that show, can you give me a little idea about your educational background, your work background, and what you're up to these days, and kind of rehash of what we covered on Prop 47?
Sure, no problem. And thank you very much for having me on again. I enjoyed the opportunity to be here some months back to discuss Prop 47, and really appreciate the invitation. So I'm Kevin Kiley. I worked as Deputy Attorney General for the state. I'm currently the Republican nominee for the California State Assembly in the 6th District. And last time we were on, we discussed an initiative that was passed in 2014 known as Prop 47. And right now in California, we're in the midst of the biggest increase in crime that we've had in some time. And that is directly attributable to the fallout from Prop 47 and a number of other misguided measures that have really...
Prop 47, from my recollection, had to do with a lot of crimes that used to be felonies were downgraded to misdemeanors. And
Absolutely.
that took some power away from prosecutors. And now I've even noticed going into Walgreens or CVS, a lot of people just walk in, they take stuff, and then people are going, "Excuse me, sir," but people are just walking out with stuff now. There's not much the storekeepers can do if it's under $1,000.
Exactly. If it's under $950, then
oh, sorry, $950. Yeah.
The punishment could be no more than a misdemeanor, no matter how many times you do it. It's not worth prosecutors even going after them. Usually it's just a citation and you're let go. And this has given birth to what's known as the frequent flyer phenomenon, where you have guys who are caught stealing, a dozen times, and still nothing can happen to them.
Okay, so, and lately, why don't we talk a little bit about your background? What's your educational background?
So I have a bachelor's from Harvard, I have a law degree from Yale, and I have a master's in secondary education from Loyola Marymount University.
So you were a school teacher for a while, right?
I was, yep. I taught 10th grade English.
Okay, and where was that?
That was down in LA.
Down in Los Angeles, okay. And the district you're running for is District?
It's District 6.
And that's near Roseville?
Yep, Roseville is the largest city in the district. It's a bit east of Sacramento.
And so didn't you have some competition in the primary?
We had a pretty competitive race, actually. Yeah, we had the most candidates of any state legislative race in all of California. There were 11 of us, and of course we have the open primary now in California, so there are 8 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and an independent. And so now it's myself and one of the Democrats that it's advanced. And it was a really spirited race. There were some great candidates in there, so I feel quite lucky to still be on my feet.
So a big day is coming November 8th, right?
That's November 8th, the general, yep.
Okay, and so you're getting prepared for that. Great. Okay, so you're going to be an assembly person or assemblyman if you prevail.
Mm-hmm.
And how many assembly people are in the state legislature?
So the assembly is one of 2 houses of the legislature. It's just like Congress for the federal government. You have the Senate and the House of Representatives there. In California, it's the same thing. You got the Senate. We just call the lower house the state assembly. So there are 80 state assembly members. Each one represents just under 500,000 people.
And their term is for how many years?
2 years.
So you have a 2-year term. And the Senate, how many senators are there in the state of California, and what's their term limit?
So 40 senators, each one represents around 1 million people, and they serve 4-year terms.
Okay, 4-year terms. And is there any term limit, or how many terms you can serve? What's that?
So you can serve up to 12 years overall, and that can be allocated any which way between the House and the Assembly.
Even if you're a governor, does that count too, or is it just for the Assembly?
That's a separate deal.
That's a separate deal, okay. Okay, so you've got a big election coming up, and tonight we want to talk a little bit about Prop 57, because that's going to be on the November 8th ballot as well.
Right, exactly.
And so that's the Public Safety and Rehabilitation Act of 2016. And I think that Governor Brown has invested a lot of money in this. And I think he's got a lot of money left in his war chest.
He has.
I don't remember the exact amounts of money he's put in it, but I know he's put in maybe about a quarter of money he has, which is several millions, I think.
Yes, he's put several
million. And he's got multiple millions that he wants to put into this. So
correct.
Governor Brown is putting a lot of prestige and money behind this. what do you think is his impetus for wanting to get this passed?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know exactly what his motivations might be. He was governor at the time that what's known as determinate sentencing went into effect in
That the three
California.
strikes?
So 3 strikes would not exactly. Determinate sentencing just sort of means that there are fixed terms, a given number of years for particular crimes.
But isn't there sometimes like from 2 to 4 or 2 to 6?
Yeah, so there's still some room for maneuver. Yeah.
Okay, all right. But a judge can't say one guy gets 6 years and the other guy gets 1 day. It's got to be
right,
2 to 6 or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay, somewhere in that range. Okay, so this Proposition 57, the proponents say that that it authorized parole consideration for people with nonviolent convictions who complete their full sentence for their primary offense. Now, some of the wording in the bill is a little complex, and so can you kind of explain to us what's a primary offense, what's a secondary offense, what's an enhancement?
Sure,
Can you give me some
sure.
examples? Run us through some examples so folks reading this bill have some idea of what it's about.
Right. Well, here's the first thing to know. That if this proposition is passed, it'll make up to 30,000 inmates eligible for early release. 16,000 of those would be eligible for early release the day that the proposition takes effect. Now, it says there in the little summary that will appear on the ballot and that was prepared by our Attorney General that this only applies to non-violent offenders. But I think you'd be surprised to learn some of the crimes that qualify as non-violent. Here are a few examples. Rape by intoxication is considered a non-violent offense. Rape of an unconscious person is considered a non-violent offense. Sex trafficking, drive-by shooting, assault with a deadly weapon, taking a hostage, false imprisonment of an elder, just to name a few. These are considered non-violent offenses.
Slow down for a second. So you're telling me that a drive-by shooting is considered non-violent?
Correct. If you actually, hit your target, then it might graduate to a violent crime.
Okay, so if you're a bad shot, then it's non-violent, but if you hit him, then you'd be in trouble. Okay,
correct,
so
correct.
All right. So, that's kind of strange because usually an attempt is just as serious as completing the crime.
Yeah, well, this is sort of a separate offense, but if you look at arson causing great bodily injury, you can actually succeed there. Still considered a non-violent crime under the law that Prop 57 will apply to. So that's the first thing to know about this initiative, is that it will lead to the early release of thousands and thousands of dangerous offenders, and voters are being misled as to who these offenders are.
Okay, well, proponents say that this is going to save taxpayer dollars by reducing wasteful spending within our correctional system. So what kind of, as things stand now, what is the wasteful spending that the proponents are talking about here? I mean, keeping too many people in prison for too long?
That's a good question. The same claims were made about Prop 47, passed 2 years ago, which has let thousands of folks out early. And an analysis by the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office has showed there have been minimal savings. And in fact, as the prison population has decreased, the costs of the corrections budget has increased. So, the fiscal impact of the initiative is anything but clear. And of course, there are vast social costs associated with increased criminal activity. But I want to get back to the question that you asked a minute ago, which is, what exactly does this mean? What is a primary offense, and all of that?
Okay, well, let's kind of move on here and talk a little bit. We'll come back to that, but let's talk a little bit about some of the due process issues and some of the issues here that it seems to me that there's going to be some big changes in the way that that defendants are viewed. Okay, because my understanding in the past, a prosecutor had the discretion of whether they were going to charge a juvenile as a as an 18-year-old, as an adult. In certain cases, if the crime was heinous or they showed there was certain maturity or the level of violence was so high that, or maybe in certain gang things that looked like they were acting as an adult. So, so what do you think about a situation like that? Is that going to be a big, is that going to stymie prosecutors somehow?
Well, so Mark's referring to another provision of Prop 57. This is a relatively less significant one than the other provisions, but is still, as you note, a potentially, a potential change to the system. This is different than what we were just talking about. This is a provision that specifically relates to juvenile offenders. The existing rule gives prosecutors the discretion whether to try them as an adult. The proposed change here would put that decision in the hands of judges, and it would also change some of the rules as far as which kind of offenses automatically qualify for treatment as an adult.
Okay, so now judges in general are more lenient than prosecutors as far as deciding whether juveniles are tried as adults. Is that kind of the sense that the proponents have, is that there'd be more juveniles staying in the juvenile system than getting bumped up in the prison system? Is that their apparent goal there?
You'd have to ask them. I mean, it is sort of a departure from the adversarial system that really defines our legal system at all levels and in all forms, which is that it's in the context of criminal cases, it's the prosecution's duty to try to prove their case, and it's the duty of the defense to try to cast doubt on that case, and then the judge is there as sort of a referee. Charging decisions usually are not put in the hands of judges, but here it would give them that decision even when it comes to, say, a 17-year-old gang member who commits a murder.
So it's kind of a little bit like the Napoleonic system.
Mm-hmm.
The judge is involved being prosecutor and judge.
Right, inquisitorial, right.
So that's kind of a big change. Okay, so one thing I think that the proponents talk about is in the juvenile system, people have an opportunity for more rehabilitation than in the prison system. Do you view that as a big difference? I mean, is it more likely the citizen's going to be rehabilitated going through the juvenile system or going through the prison system? Do you have any thoughts on that? It seems that their idea is that there's a chance the juvenile could be recovered, I guess, going to the juvenile system.
Yeah, I mean, usually when a juvenile is tried as an adult, it's really only the most serious cases, and where the crime has shown an adult-like faculty for depravity on the part of the juvenile. This again is a provision that I don't think is going to be a good one, but it's comparatively minor when next to the major provisions of this initiative, which could potentially release up to 30,000 dangerous offenders early.
Okay, so one of the claims of proponents is this: the Prop 57 keeps the most dangerous offenders locked up. And they're saying over the last several decades, California's jail and prison population have exploded, and California spends nearly 10% of its general fund on our prison system, and we're spending too much money locking up nonviolent offenders. So what the Proposition 57 proponents are saying that this is only for nonviolent offenders. But let's kind of go back and let's touch back on what we're saying: the primary offense, secondary offense, enhancements.
Yeah.
How sentencings are figured out.
Right.
And how is this going to affect that?
So it on its face applies to nonviolent offenders. Of course, we've seen that many of these offenders are committing some of the worst crimes you can think of. Basically, this initiative would be a blow to the heart of what's known as proportionate sentencing. The idea that if you commit a more serious crime, maybe you should do more time. Or if you commit multiple crimes, maybe you should receive more punishment than someone who commits just one. Or if you have convictions for serious crimes in your past, maybe that merits additional punishment. Prop 57 would sort of in one fell swoop sweep all of that aside. And these are fairly common sense, intuitive ideas that have are deeply embedded in our criminal code and have been vital towards public safety in California. So when you receive a sentence, your primary offense, if you're convicted of multiple crimes, that's the longest sentence that you're given, the most serious crime. Now, under existing law, you can still be punished for the other convictions and then serve those sentences consecutively. what this initiative would do is it say that regardless of how many other crimes you're convicted of and the other consecutive sentences that are imposed, you'll be eligible for parole after you've served the primary term.
Okay, let's say that you rob a bank. Okay, so you've got an armed robbery. Let's say that you end up shooting the guard, okay, and the guard dies. So you've got a murder, and let's say you're using a gun in the crime. So those would be, I guess, gun would be an enhancement. You've got a murder and you've got an armed robbery. How would this work for those? You're telling me the armed robbery might get thrown out, and the murder would be the count?
So yeah, good question. So if you have multiple convictions, then you would only have to serve the prison term for the primary offense. When then you'd be eligible for parole. You could be released after you've served that, regardless of how many other years were tacked on because of the other crimes. So that's one way that this would lead to early releases, is by getting rid, or at least making people eligible for early release before they've served the consecutive sentences. Now, a second way in which it would undermine existing sentencing laws is by making inmates eligible for parole before they've served enhancements. And so, you know, you're familiar with an enhancement. This is if you commit a crime in such a way that it's especially bad, above and beyond the garden variety version of the crime.
Let's say you're drunk driving, but you're going over 80 miles an hour. That could be enhancement. Or let's say you're drunk driving, but you're drunk, but you're over a .15 or something like that. So, you know, so enhancement's usually committing the crime, but doing something a little extra.
Yeah, so
more dangerous.
You brought up a good example in your initial scenario, which is that, you know, if you commit robbery, you'll get a certain sentence. And then if you happen to use a gun during the commission of the robbery, then there'll be extra years tacked on because that's worse. That makes the robbery worse.
Right.
Or if it's a hate crime, or if the crime is connected with gang activity, or if there are multiple victims. Those are all things that lead to extra years being added to your sentence, and deservedly so, because this causes more suffering. This is a more serious violation of the law. Yet Prop 57 would say, well, it's after you've served the term for the garden variety offense, regardless of how many years you are required to serve for the enhancement, you can be released right then and there.
Okay, well, let's, so what we're talking about here is this is a pretty serious proposition. It changes a lot of things. And, you know, so there's a lot of technicalities, and I'm glad you straightened some of those out.
Right.
But let's kind of move on and think of what is going to be the outcome of this. I mean, what will be the eventual result in your prediction? And then what do the proponents predict? And also looking at Prop 47, what was the outcome of that? So let's kind of, you know, look into our crystal ball here and see what we think might happen if this is passed. What would remain the same if it's not passed? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, this is the last thing that our state needs right now. We're in the midst of an uptick in crime that, you know, the likes of which we haven't seen in a long time in this state. We've had several measures, the latest being Prop 47, that have lowered the penalties for criminal activity, that have released thousands of offenders early, and that have weakened the ability of law enforcement to effectively fight crime. And, you know, in San Francisco, for example, there's been an increase in property crimes, not of 6%, not of 66%, but of 666%. And we've seen big increases in violent crime as well. And so the answer, in my opinion, and a centerpiece of my campaign, is let's put public safety first again when it comes to the way we approach fighting crime.
Well, the proponents of Prop 57, for instance, say that this would be a great thing because it gives something for the prisoners, someone who's convicted, something to aim for. You know, they can get some time off if they take classes, if they don't get into any altercations with guards or other prisoners, so they don't get written up. So this gives them some kind of goals, and that helps towards their rehabilitation.
Sure.
What do you say to that argument?
Well, so this is a third provision now that you're bringing up. We've talked about two already. One being the basically elimination to a large degree of proportionate sentencing. A second being the shift in basically charging discretion for juveniles from prosecutors to judges. Now you're alluding to a third provision of this initiative, which would give the Department of Corrections an unlimited ability to award what they call good conduct credits, so for the sort of things that you mentioned. And under existing law, we have these things. In fact, the usual scenario is someone only serves half their sentence, and because of these sort of credits. And there are good behavior credits that are in the system now within limits. But this would basically give the Department of Corrections state bureaucrats the ability to let even violent offenders, not just non-violent offenders that the other provisions apply to, but to let murderers, rapists, out of prison early based upon what they deem to be good behavior.
Okay, well, one thing that the bill states that it would require that the Secretary of Corrections certify that the regulations implementing these policies protect and enhance public safety. So that's kind of an interesting clause. It's going to require the Secretary of Corrections to certify that this is going to protect and enhance public safety. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we should note that the name of Prop 57 is the Public Safety and Rehabilitation Act. So, you know, the proponent and Prop 47 had a similarly Orwellian name. So I don't think we can take great confidence in this requirement that there's a stipulation that the early releases are the interest of public safety.
Okay, so let's look at a couple of other. So Governor Brown so far has spent about $5 million, and he still has $20 million in that fund. So he's arguing that we've got to get these reforms done, and I guess he's got a bankroll or a war chest of $20 million. He spent about a quarter of that. Do you have any idea of the opponents? What do they have in their war chest?
I don't know exactly what their fundraising is looking like now, but I do know that there is a coalition of law enforcement officials that have lined up very emphatically behind the No campaign for this initiative. District attorneys and sheriffs and judges and victims groups from across the state who don't want to see, you know, folks who rape an unconscious person, for example, let out of prison early. I'll give you one example of, you know, someone who will be eligible for early release under this initiative. A gentleman named Andrew Stewart Luster was arrested for rape in 2003. He fled to Mexico, was eventually captured, returned to California. He was convicted of 20 counts of drug-induced rape and 17 counts of raping an unconscious victim. He was originally sentenced to 124 years in prison. In 2013, a judge ordered him to prison for 50 years. As an interesting side note, when he sort of skipped bail, it was Dog the Bounty Hunter who brought him back. Oh, but in any case, Andrew Stewart Luster, if Prop 57 passes, will be eligible for immediate release. And there are countless others like him who are just not the sort of offenders that should be let out of prison before they serve their prison.
So Andrew's looking at how many years? He got 50 and then plus another 122. So he's
50 overall right now that,
50 overall.
That he's serving, yeah, for 17 counts of raping an unconscious victim.
Okay, so he's looking at 50 years, and that could be kind of, he could get clemency for that under this new Prop 57.
Right, because, you know, if you're convicted of multiple counts, remember, you only have to serve the term for one of them.
And also, if you're doing drive-by shootings and you're a bad shot, then you get clemency for that as well, right?
Right. I mean, I don't know if it's quite fair to call it clemency, but you're eligible to be released for parole after serving the primary term. Okay,
so now let's talk a little bit about Marcy's Law, 3 strikes and you're out. So what would this have effects on the 3 strikes policy?
Yes, it would. And this is the third way in which this initiative would compromise proportionate sentencing. Again, the idea that the more serious the crime, the more time you should get. The first, remember, was by kind of discounting your other crimes.
Right.
The second was by making you eligible for parole before enhancements. The third is that it ignores the convictions that you have in your past. So 3 strikes was passed, for example, to create this escalating punishments. So you'll be punished more severely for your second felony than you were for your first. Again, this initiative would make you eligible for parole after you've served the term for your primary offense, irrespective of whatever additional punishment would have been imposed by virtue of your earlier offenses.
Okay, and how about gang-related activity? Does this have much bearing on that?
Yeah, this is so gang-related activity. If a crime is connected to a gang, that's an enhancement that can get you additional time. And this is a big objection of law enforcement groups, actually, is that they rely on enhancements like the gang-related activity to try to deter and break up gangs. And this
So
is going to
Prop 57 would lessen that enhancement or remove that enhancement
Yeah, exactly.
altogether?
You could, exactly.
Okay. All right. So, Governor Brown says that he regrets his support in 1977 when he was governor last time for establishing determinative sentencing laws in California. Now, he says these have led to the establishment of strict sentencing guidelines, mandatory minimum sentences, and enhanced sentences for certain crimes. And so he's saying he regrets that. And so you're saying that maybe this determinative sentences is a good thing. Can you discuss that just real briefly? What's your feelings on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, is our criminal justice system perfect? No, of course not. I think that there is certainly room for thoughtful people to have a serious discussion as to where our sentencing law does and does not make sense. I do think that the reforms that we made in the Wilson administration, for example, to increase the penalties for the most serious crimes has served the public well. It led to a couple decades of decreased crime. It improved public safety. And now Governor Brown is rolling all of that back. And he's doing so, or the proponents of Prop 57, as well as Prop 47, are doing so in a way that is not forthright with the public as to what the risks are. When you call something the Public Safety and Rehabilitation Act or the Safe Schools Act, but what it actually does is let thousands of dangerous offenders out of prison early, that's not being forthright with the public about the risk. If you say it only applies to nonviolent offenders, but in fact you're letting out folks committed of raping an unconscious person or assault with a deadly weapon or domestic violence involving trauma, that's not being forthright with the public. So we can have those discussions, and there are discussions that should be had I will look forward to engaging with folks on the legislature as to how we can best protect public safety. But the way to do it isn't by misleading the public into something that, that's going to really have a detrimental effect on people's lives.
Well, I think one of the selling points of this bill, and I actually would support these particular ones, where that, if they could have more incentives for inmates to be good behind bars.
Yeah.
But maybe, so that part of this bill, I think, is what's kind of pushing it through, and some of these technicalities aren't as well understood.
Sure.
So I think that, people should look very carefully at this, do some studying before November 8th. And then also, I wish you the best on November 8th. And I'm real happy you could come here tonight and discuss